coming. Before I begin what is essentially a progress report on some of my current work, I want to thank Yanni and Rosemary and the wonderful staff of the Athens Centre, including Isabella, who's trying hard to focus me, and Katya, for your extraordinary generosity and your friendship and your hospitality. Xenia was perhaps the greatest virtue of ancient Greece, and Yanni and Rosemary have gracefully maintained that ancient tradition. Chris and I appreciate that all you have done for us over the last 5 weeks and over many years, and we look forward to our next visit in 2015, if not earlier than that. And now, Katya, would you please turn off the lights? This kind of archaic Greek statue, known as the kouros, was invented around the middle of the 7th century BC. All dates will be BC. Only a generation or two later, a sculptor from Naxos carved a kouros out of a block of Naxian marble and dedicated it to Apollo in his sanctuary on Delos. At least we think it was a kouros. There is even less of it now than there used to be in the early 20th century. Part of the left foot, merely the tips of a couple of toes on the right foot. And so there is a small possibility that it was an offering bearer who just stood like a kouros, upright, left leg advanced, like, say, the ram bearer or Kritios of Thasos. In any case, its plinth was set into a roughly worked, roughly triangular marble boulder, adorned at the corners with the heads of a ram, a lion, and a gorgon, so that the statue stood at a slight angle upon it. That is to say, whoever stood directly before the ram-headed corner of the base would have seen the statue in a slight three-quarter view. The kouros would have turned slightly to the spectator's left, so that its Apollo-like stride would have been clear. But the view of the monument opened up still more, since the spectator was encouraged to attend to the side of the base between the ram and the lion by an inscription that begins on the top and continues boustrophodon style, like an ox plows the field, left to right, then right to left, and left to right again, reading, Euthykartides, the Naxian, dedicated me, having made me, presumably. Now, the only things we know for sure about Euthykartides are what this inscription, which is almost certainly the earliest Greek sculptor's signature, and those poor little toes tell us. The man was from Naxos. He dedicated a statue that he himself carved in a sanctuary that was fast becoming one of the most important in Greece. He departed from a pure frontality that might have been expected of a kouros this early, and so he encouraged the spectator to view it from more than one point of view. And he worked in a monumental stone sculptural tradition that was, in the last quarter of the 7th century, still brand new. This much about Euthykartides we know. But given the absence of any other work that we might attribute to him, and given his absence from our usual ancient literary sources, Pausanias, or Pliny, or Plutarch, and so on, his artistic personality is irretrievably lost. And so he occupies a familiar position held by most of the Greek artists whose names we happen to know. He was not on present evidence, and those toes are the evidence. He was not an individual artistic genius who used the sculpture self-consciously to express himself. And his statue was completely conventional, even if the convention itself was in its infancy. His statue stood like all kouroi had stood and would always stand until the death of the type about a century later, not long after the Aristotle's kouros in the National Museum was carved. But neither was his statue an anonymous product of an impersonal craft. which is Rice Carpenter's absolutist but influential characterization of Greek sculpture. A description that has been seized upon by many scholars in my field who wish to overthrow the idea of the individual creative artist as the principal generator of artistic change, and who wish to banish the concepts of genius and personality from art history. The idea that art mechanically runs its course apart from the minds and intentions of artists, even if we cannot always discern what artistic intention is. The idea that the course of Greek art was propelled solely by impersonal, social, or historical forces acting upon passive, interchangeable automatons who were at best menial laborers, rude mechanicals, as Shakespeare calls them in Midsummer Night's Dream, or bounosoi, as they were called in ancient Greek. This is an idea that I cannot accept. I refute that idea by uttering the names Polygnotus, Polykleides, Praxiteles, Apelles, Zeuxis, and Lysippus. Demonstrably innovative and influential artists who did not merely reflect or channel their culture, but generated it, sending Greek art on new and original trajectories. Now, I do not mean that we should heroize or deify the artist. I don't think we should heroize the art historian either, by the way. And I do not mean that society or audience cannot exert power over the artist. He too is a cultural product. But in my view, the many reports of the death of the author or the death of the artist, and most of these reports are French, have been greatly exaggerated. So let us just stipulate that artists shape culture and culture shapes them and move on. What I wanted to address this evening are the interlocking issues of identity, status, and originality of the Greek artist. And Euthykartides is a good place to start. For although the kouros was canonical, although the kouros was eminently reproducible, this canonical genre did not have the power to stifle Euthykartides' impulse to declare, with his own signature, his own identity, his difference. These little bits of sculpture are not anonymous. And for Euthykartides, the original dedication was very personal indeed. This is so because we can plausibly infer a few other things about Euthykartides and his dedication. That the monument was a votive, meant primarily to adorn the burgeoning precinct of Delian Apollo, that it was a monument of devotion, is clear enough. But the god was hardly the statue's only intended audience. Any dedication is itself an entry into a competition of votives. And so the inscription must also have been a kind of advertisement meant to inform and impress priests, pilgrims, and potential patrons. This is what you can expect from Euthykartides. Now, this work is certainly not about self-expression. Carpenter is right about that. But it is about self-promotion. It is about the mastery of material and form. And it is also about Euthykartides' rivalry, both with other sculptors for commissions and with other dedicants for the favor of Apollo. The signature was signed in the end because Euthykartides was proud of his work, and also perhaps because he was proud of being able to write at a time when the art of writing was probably not widespread. His piety and his self-interest provided the impetus to display his mastery of skillful production. Skillful production is, I think, a better translation of the word techne than art or artistry, its usual translations. His techne allowed him to display his piety and win prestige. His literacy allowed him to declare his identity. And his apparent wealth made all of that possible. For the fact that he could afford the marble in the first place, had the time a year or more to rough out the statue and base in an Oxian quarry like this one that Chris and I visited just a couple of days ago, and then finish the ensemble in his workshop, and then could hire a ship to transport the monument to Delos, some 30 kilometers away, and finally dedicate it to Apollo in his own name, presumably having negotiated with the priesthood of Delos for a nice spot in the sanctuary. All of this indicates that Euthykartides was a 7th century man of means, literate and prosperous, and possibly even high-born. And even if his social standing was not that of an aristocrat, he could at least afford to act like one. Now, the orthodox view, repeated as if it were uncontroversial in standard surveys of Greek art and archaeology like the one at the top of the screen, the orthodox view is that artists and artisans had very low status in ancient Greece. And it is true. Xenophon and Aristotle and other ancient authors did not hold artists in very high regard, finding them physically and thus morally and politically deficient. Xenophon believes that artists became effeminate from their work. I can assure the ghost of Xenophon that hammering away at a marble block for a year or more does not make the body soft. And we need not consider such right-wing prejudices as Aristotle's the rule at all times or in all places. Sweeping generalizations crash upon the rocks of fact. For the very first Greek sculptor whose name we know, the first one to sign his work and announce his identity and so consciously distinguish himself from other sculptors, in fact acted very much like later sculptors who were renowned for their success, for their standing, for their wealth. Sculptors such as the 4th century sculptor Praxiteles, whose family evidently married into the Athenian aristocracy, and who must have made a fortune just from his bronze statues. Or the even later sculptor Damophon of Messene, who donated the cult statues of Lycosaur that are in the National Museum. He donated these cult statues at Lycosaur. And for that act of generosity and largesse, he was built his own hero shrine at Messene, possibly crowned with a bronze statue of the sculptor himself. Like them, Euthykartides must have sweated plenty when he carved his kouros, but he was no mere rude mechanical. He was no mere Bonosos. Now, there are ancient artistic traditions that fit Carpenter's anonymous and impersonal characterization pretty well, but they're not Greek. They are Egyptian, and even better, Mesopotamian. And to a considerable degree, they are also Etruscan and Roman. We do not have the time to survey those other ancient art histories, so I humbly ask you to believe me when I tell you that in the entire 3,000-year-long history of Egyptian art, there are only a few works of art or architecture that can be tied directly to known artists. The step pyramid at Saqqara, probably built by Imhotep, is one of them. This famous head of Nefertiti, found in a workshop belonging to a sculptor named Tutmosis, is another. But in ancient Egypt, there are practically no equivalents of Euthykartides, the Naxian, made and dedicated. I also hope you'll believe me when I say that Sumerian and Mesopotamian art is, if anything, even more anonymous and impersonal than Egyptian art. In fact, signatures in the ancient Near East and Sumer are completely unknown. There is not one. Instead, we have works of art like these, showing the king making mud brick to build a ziggurat, or a king seated with a blueprint in his lap, as if he were the architect. The king was the agent of art and architecture in the Near East. Simply put, the celebration of artistic individuality, the celebration of personality, the celebration of originality, was not Egyptian or Near Eastern practice. Neither was the mere declaration of identity and authorship that a signature provides. And in this respect, Greek artists were different not just from the Egyptians and the peoples of the Near East, but from peoples a bit closer to home, say the Etruscans and the Romans. About Etruscan architects and artists themselves, we know next to nothing. But our ignorance cannot completely be the result of our only partial understanding of the Etruscan language. We hear in our sources of a sculptor named Vulca from Veii, and it has been hard to resist linking him to the terracotta revetments and statuary from the Portonaccio temple in his hometown of Veii. But Vulca is the only Etruscan artist that our literary sources remember by name, and if he signed anything, we don't have it. While statements of ownership or dedication are known on Etruscan pots, on mirrors, goldwork, artist signatures, like the one on the screen, are very rare. And there are no Etruscan signatures at all on any of the supposedly major Etruscan works we have, even those that bear other kinds of inscriptions, like the Chimera Lorenzo or La Ringatore. The impulse for self-identification among Etruscan artists seems, in short, to have been weak. As for the Romans, there are, of course, many artists named in the literary sources dealing with the artistic environment of Rome and the Roman world during the Republic and the Empire, but the names tend to be Greek, and no doubt belong to ethnic Greci, brought to Rome under commission, or Greek freedmen put to work by Roman patrons in the city of Rome itself or elsewhere. There is, for example, the Apollonius, son of Archias the Athenian, who signed a bronze herm from Herculaneum, replicating the upper part of the Doryphorus of Polyclitus. And there's Glycon of Athens, who signed a recreation of a Lysipan Heracles on a huge scale for the baths of Caracalla. We know the names of many Roman painters and architects from our literary sources, but actual Roman signatures are few and far between. We know from our literary sources that Severus and Caelor built Nero's Golden House. We know from our literary sources that Famulus painted it, but we don't have their signatures. In fact, on all the painted walls of Pompeii, and there are a lot of painted walls at Pompeii, there is only one artist's signature. It is the cursory Lucius painted this in the house of Octavius Quarto. But it is in fact not clear whether Lucius is taking credit for the truly awful paintings of Pyramus and Thisbe and Narcissus on the wall above, or whether he's just referring to the painted bench where the signature is actually found. And the largest and most famous signature in Rome is really nothing of the sort. It's a mere homage, because Marcus Agrippa did not build this Pantheon, but an earlier one. And it is unlikely that he was the architect of that temple anyway. As was the case in Egypt and in Mesopotamia, the agent of the major work of Roman art and architecture was the emperor, or the senate. It was the patron who counted, and the names of sculptors or architects are for the most part absent. We have no names to associate with the altar of the Augustan Peace, or the Colosseum, or the Arch of Titus, or the spiral frieze on the column of Trajan. There are some exceptions, but for the most part, the Roman artist and architect did not sign. In short, the history of Egyptian and Near Eastern art and architecture, the history of Etruscan art and architecture, the history even of Roman art and architecture cannot possibly be written as a history of artists and architects. In contrast, you theoretically could write a history of Greek art and architecture that is just a history of Greek artists and architects or those whose names we happen to know. That wouldn't be a very good idea, but you could do it. The point is this. The Greeks are exceptional among the peoples of the ancient Mediterranean, both in the numbers of artists and architects whose names are remembered in the literary tradition or that are preserved in inscriptions, and they are exceptional in the number of signatures they left behind. Now I concede, and I concede yet again, and I concede yet again, that by far the majority of Greek works of art are unsigned. The impulse to take or to be assigned credit for a statue or a vase or a temple was hardly universal or constant. I admit too that some of the texts I will be calling signatures are not really autographs. They may not have been written by the artist himself. For example, as long as he had his paintbrush out anyway, a vase painter might sign for the potter he worked for. And the Greek sculptor regularly left the texting on a statue's base to a professional letterer. We know one scribe, for example, who signed bases for 3 different sculptors. And we know of one sculptor who employed at least 3 different professional letterers. Still, Greek art boasts more artists and artist names and signatures in, say, the 1 century between 525 and 425 than Egyptian art does in 3,000 years, or that Roman art does in its long history. That probably means something. It probably has something to do with the relatively high esteem in which Greeks not named Xenophon or Aristotle could hold the artist. And certainly it has something to do with the pride that the Greek artist had in himself. So, what could the Greek artist sign anyway? The answer is just about anything. There are, for example, archaic and classical gems signed by such artists as Epimanes and Dexamenos. Gems are objects of personal adornment. They're private works, where signatures might have added a certain, even intimate cachet. But coins are another matter. They are public works minted by the state. And yet there are splendid coins from late 5th century Sicily, signed by artists whose skills were so much admired by the city that they were remarkably allowed to engrave their names upon them. Now the practice is rare elsewhere, and the Sicilian die engraver is clever about it. On the Syracusan silver coin, at the upper left, the signature Eutykartides appears very lightly, you probably can barely see it, beneath Arethusa's head. On the other coin, the lower right, a Nike holds a tablet engraved with the artist's name. On this coin, Euclides has almost hidden his name in the ornament of Athena's helmet. It's there, I assure you. And on the decagram below, the last letters of the artist's name, M-O-N, his name is Chiron, written on Arethusa's headband, disappear beneath her hair. You might just make out the K-I at the beginning of his name. The rest of the name presumably is there beneath her hair, but you can't see it. And on this silver coin from Agragas, a die cutter named Polyaenus signs his name in minuscule on the lowest feather of an eagle devouring a hare. Again, you can barely see it, but it's there. Discreet, partial, even coy these signatures might be. But it is astonishing that they are there at all. And it is difficult to maintain that the artists who wrote them were held in low esteem, or that their works were anonymous and impersonal. Syracuse and Akragas were proud to have these artists cut their dies. And so they were permitted to treat public works as instruments of personal promotion, tantalizing us with a few letters of their names. If If die engravers wrote small, Greek builders could write big. On the steps of the early 6th century Temple of Apollo at Syracuse, there is a late 6th century inscription that might be the signature of a Cleomenes, who began the building, and an Epicles, who finished it. These are beautiful works, the inscription adds. Now, this isn't the only possible reading of the inscription, it is true, but it is certain that other 6th century projects, a bridge on the island of Samos, for example, were signed. And it is certain that on the Acropolis of Thasos, a late 6th century mason signed the city wall, Parmenon made me, Parmenon built me, unless he was just taking credit for that one block on which his signature appears, which I think is unlikely. Much later, if we can believe the Roman geographer Strabo, the architect Sesostris of Knidos signed the lighthouse of Alexandria in big bronze letters. Or, if we prefer to believe another ancient source, Lucian, he signed more ingeniously, writing his patron's name, King Ptolemy, on surface plaster that eventually deteriorated to reveal his own signature permanently chiseled in the stone beneath. The painters of walls and panels signed their work too. The best examples are the lost but well-described murals of Troy sacked and the underworld in the Cnidian clubhouse at Delphi, where in a kind of signature, an elegiac couplet by Simonides identified the artist as one of the most important and inventive of the 5th century. Polygnotus, Thasian by birth, Aglaophon's son, painted the sacking of Ilion citadel. Poetry is not immortal, but Simonides, the poet, is. Polygnotus, who by eliminating the artificial ground line in his paintings, changed the way the world was represented, and thus the way the world was seen, Polygnotus is specifically excluded from the ranks of Bounacii by Plutarch. The Delphic Ecfictiones held him in high enough regard to award him free food and lodging for life. In Athens, Polygnotus was a member of Chimon's inner circle, reportedly living in sin with Chimon's sister, and he painted panels in several Athenian buildings for free. Paintings by Polygnotus hung in the Stoa Poikile, the painted stoa in the Agora, a kilometer away. He painted these panels in Athens for free, and a grateful Athens bestowed citizenship upon him in return. So much for easy generalizations like Greek artists were held in low esteem. There were more painter signatures in the 4th century, not coincidentally an era of powerful artistic personalities and rivalries. According to one source, the great Parrhasius signed his paintings in verse, boasting that he had touched the limits of the art of painting and was the foremost practitioner of art among the Greeks. And it's hard to believe that Parrhasius' flamboyant rival Zeuxis, who was so rich that he gave his paintings away, claiming they were priceless, and who at Olympia displayed his great wealth by having his name woven into his cloaks in gold thread, it is hard to believe that Zeuxis did not write his name upon his paintings. Like painters on walls or panels, Greek mosaicists signed their work on floors, though the practice was hardly common. In the late 4th century, Gnosis signed this fine pebble mosaic, the upper left, at Pella. Farther afield, at Thymuis in the Nile Delta, one Sophilus signed this portrait of a wild-eyed, Medusa-like Ptolemaic queen in the late 3rd or early 2nd century BC. We are told by Pliny that the Hellenistic artist Sasis laid a mosaic of an unswept floor at Pergamon. We don't have that, but we have a 2nd century AD copy of that mosaic from Rome, signed by a Heraclitus. And in the early 2nd century BC, again at Pergamon, Hephaestion signed a mosaic floor in a palace on a piece of trompe l'oeil parchment you see in the bottom right. on Delos. One Asclepiades made and signed this floor in the House of the Dolphins. And he signed in Greek, even though he came from Arados in Phoenicia.